Chapter 9 A Day to Spend Part 1 Again, it was September at Silverbush, a whole year since Aunt Hazel was married. Now it seemed to Pat that Aunt Hazel had always been married. She and Uncle Bob often came home for a visit, and Pat was very fond of Uncle Bob now, and even thought his flying jibs were nice. The last time, too, Aunt Hazel had a darling, tiny baby with amber brown eyes like Pat's own. Cuddles wasn't a baby any longer. She was toddling round on her own chubby legs, and was really a sister to be proud of. She had been through all her teething at 11 months. It was beautiful to watch her waking up, and beautiful to bend over her while she was asleep. She seemed to know you were there, and would smile delightedly. A spirit of her own, too. When she was 8 months old, she had been bitten Uncle Tom when he poked a finger into her mouth to find out if she had any teeth. He found out. And now had come the invitations for Pat to spend a Saturday at the Bayshore farm with Great-Aunt Frances Selby and Great-Aunts Honor Atkins. Not to mention Cousin Dan Gowdy and a still greater aunt, who was Mother's great-aunt. Pat's head was usually dizzy when she got this far, and small wonder, as Judy would say. Pat loved the sound of a day to spend. It sounded so gloriously lavish to spend a whole day, letting its moments slip one by one through your fingers like beads of gold. But she was not enthusiastic over spending it at the Bayshore. When she and Sid had been very small, they had called the Bayshore the Don't Touch It house, guiltily to themselves. Everybody was so old there. 2 years ago, when she had been there with Mother, she remembered how Aunt Frances frowned because, when they were walking in the orchard, she, Pat, had picked a lovely, juicy red plum from a laden tree, and Aunt Honor, a tall lady with snow-white hair and eyes as black as her dress, had asked her to repeat some Bible verses and had been coldly astonished when Pat made mistakes in them. The great-aunts always asked you to repeat Bible verses. So said Winnie and Joe, who had been there often, and you never could tell what they would give you when you got through, a dime, or a cookie, or a tap on the head. But to go alone to the Bayshore. Sidney had been asked too, but Sidney had gone to visit Uncle Brian's while his teeth were attended to. Perhaps it was just as well, because Sidney was not in high favor at the Bayshore, having fallen asleep at the supper table and tumbled ingloriously off his chair to the floor, with an heirloom goblet in his hand the last time he was there. Pat talked it over with Judy Friday evening, sitting on the sandstone steps at the kitchen door and working her sums to be all ready for Monday. Pat was a year older and an inch taller by the marks Judy kept on the old pantry door where she measured every child on its birthday. She was well on in subtraction, and Judy was helping her. She could add and subtract. When her head was clear, she could multiply. Division she never attempted. The kitchen behind them was full of the spicy smell of Judy's kettle of pickles. Gentleman Tom was sitting on the well platform, keeping an eye on Sniggle Fritz, who was dozing on the cellar door, keeping an eye on Gentleman Tom. In the corner of the yard was a splendid pile of cut hardwood, which Pat and Sid had stacked neatly up in the summer evenings after school. Pat gloated over it. It was so prophetic of cozy, cheerful winter evenings when the wind would growl and snarl because it couldn't get into Silverbush. Pat would have been perfectly happy if it had not been for the morrow's visit. "The aunts are so stately," she confided to Judy. She would never have dared criticize them to Mother, who had been a Selby, and was very proud of her people. "The grandmother of them was a Chidlaw," said Judy, as if that explained everything. "I'm not saying but they're a bit grim, but they've had a terrible lot of funerals at the Bayshore. Your Aunt Frances lost her man afore she married him, and your Aunt Honor lost hers after she married him, and they've niver settled which got the worst of it. They're a bit near, too, it must be confessed, and them with lashings of money, but they do be rail kind at heart, and they think a lot of all your mother's children." "I don't mind Aunt Frances or Aunt Honor, But I'm a little afraid of Great-Aunt Hannah and Cousin Dan, confessed Pat. Oh, you needn't be. Maybe you'll not be seeing the old lady at all. She hasn't left her own room for 16 years, and she's 93 by the clock, so she is. And there don't be many seeing her. And old Danny is harmless. He fell asleep at the top of the stairs and rolled down them when he was a lad. He was never the same again. But some do be saying he saw the ghost. Oh, Judy, is there a ghost at Bayshore? Not now, but long ago there was. Oh, they were terrible ashamed of it. Why? You know, they thought it was kind of a disgraceful thing to have a ghost in the house. Some folks do be thinking it an honor, but there you are. I'm not denying the Bayshore ghost was a troublesome creature. And he was such a nice, friendly, sociable ghost, and hadn't any rail dog sense about the proper time for appearing. He was a bit lonesome, it would seem. He would sit round on the footboards of their beds and look at them mournful like, as if to say, "Why the devil won't you throw a civil word to a felly?" And then, when company would come over, they would all enjoying themselves. They'd hear a deep sigh, and there me fine ghost was. It was by way of being terrible monotonous after a while. But the ghost was never seen again after your great-great-uncle died, and your great-aunt Honor took to running things. I'm thinking she was a bit too near, even for a ghost, that one. So you needn't be afraid of seeing him, but you'd better not be looking too close at the vase that makes the faces. A vase that makes faces? Sure, me jewel. It's on the parlor mantel, and it made a face once at Sarah Jenkins. It was hired there when she was dusting it. She was neither to hold nor bend wid fright. This was delightful. But, after all, Pat thought Judy was a little too contemptuous of the Bayshore people. Their furniture is very grand, Judy. Grand, is it? Judy knew very well she had been snubbed. Oh, you can't be telling me anything about grandeur. Didn't I work in Castle McDermott when I was a slip of the girleen? Grandeur, is it? Lace and satin bed quilts, I'm telling you. And a white marble staircase with a golden banister. Dinner sets of solid gold, and vases full of champagne. And 30 servants if there was one. Sure, and they kept servants to wait on the other servants there. The old lord would pass round plates with gold sovereigns at the Christmas dinner, and help yourself. Oh, what's your Bayshore farm to that? I'm asking. And now just run over their vases last Sunday, in case your Aunt Honor wants you to say some. I can't say them without a mistake to you, Judy, but it will be so different with Aunt Honor. Sure, and you'd better just shut your eyes and pretend she's a cabbage-head darling. Though old Jed Cartmole didn't be thinking her when he put him in his place at the revival meetings. What did she do, Judy? Do, is it? I'm telling you, old Jed thought he was extra clever because he didn't believe in God. Just by way of showing off one night, he went into one of the revival meetings old Mr. Campbell was having when he was a minister at South Glen, and after all the testimonies, me bold Jed gets up and says he, "I'm not believing there's any God, but if there is, he do be a cruel, unreasonable old tyrant. And now," says Jed, swelling up all over with constate like an old Tom Turkey, "if there is a God, why doesn't he strike me dead for what I've said? I dare him to do it," says old Jed, feeling bigger than ever. Everybody was so shocked you could have heard a pin fall, and your Aunt Honors turns round and says she, cool like, "Do you really think you're of that much importance to God, Jedediah Cartmole?" Everybody laughed. Did ye ever be seeing one of them big red balloons when you've stuck a pin in it? Oh, that was me proud Jed. He was never the same again. Now ye sums are done, and me pickles are done, so we'll just have a bit of fun roasting some crab apples with cloves stuck in 'em for scent. I wish Sid was here, sighed Pat. He does love clove apples so. Will he be back Sunday night, do you think, Judy? I can't live another week without him.
You set your heart too much on city, me jewel. What'll you be after doing when ye grow up and have to part? Oh, that'll never be, Judy. Sid and I are never going to part. We'll neither of us marry, but just live on here at Silverbush and take care of everything. We'll have it all settled. Judy sighed. I wish you wouldn't be so set on him. Why don't you be after getting yourself a chum in school like the other little girls? Winnie has lashings of them. I don't want anybody but Sid. The girls in school are nice, but I don't love any of them. I don't want to love anyone or anything but my own family in Silverbush.
Part 2. Since Pat had to go to the Bayshore farm, she was glad it was this particular Saturday, because Father was going to replace the old board fence around the orchard with a new one. Pat hated to see the old fence torn down. It was covered with such pretty lichens, and vines had grown over its posts, and there was a wave of caraway all along it as high as your waist. Judy had a reason for being glad, too. The use had gone forth, and that the big poplar in the corner of the yard must be cut down, because its core was rotten, and the next wind might send it crashing down on the hen house. Judy had plotted with Long Alec to cut it down the day Pat was away, for she knew every blow of the axe would go to the darlint's heart. Joe ran Pat down to the Bayshore in the car. She bent from it as it whirled out of the lane to wave goodbye to Silverbush. Cuddles's dear little rompers on the line behind the house were plumped out with the wind and looked comically like 3 small little Cuddleses swinging from the line. Pat sighed and then resolved to make the best of things. The day was lovely, full of blue, sweet autumn hazes. The road to the Bayshore was mostly downhill, running for part of the way through spruce barrens, its banks edged with ferns, sweet-smelling bay bushes, and clusters of scarlet pigeonberries. There was a blue, waiting sea at the end of an old grey house fronting the sunset, so close to the purring waves that in storms their spray dashed over its very doorstep. A wise old house that knew many things, as Pat always felt. Mother's old home, and therefore to be loved, whether one could love the people in it or not. It still made quite a sensation at Bayshore when one arrived in a car. The aunts came out and gave a prim welcome, and Cousin Dan waved from a near field where he was turning over the sod into beautiful red furrows, so even and smooth. Cousin Dan was very proud of his ploughing. Joe whirled away, leaving Pat to endure her ordeal of welcome and examination. The great aunts were as stiff as the starched white petticoats that were still worn at Bayshore. To tell truth, the great aunts were really frightfully at a loss what to say to this long-legged sunburned child, whom they thought it a family duty to invite to Bayshore once in so long. Then Pat was taken up to the great aunt's room for a few minutes. She went reluctantly. Great-great-aunt Hannah was so mysteriously old, a tiny, shrunken, wrinkled creature peering out at her from a mound of quilts in a huge curtained bed. "So, this is Mary's little girl," said a piping voice. "No, I am Patricia Gardner," said Pat, who hated to be called anybody's little girl, even mother's. Great-great-aunt Hannah put a claw-like hand on Pat's arm and drew her close to the bed, peering at her with old, old blue eyes, so old that sight had come back to them. Nay, beauty, she muttered. "She may grow up better looking than you expect," said Aunt Frances, as one determinedly looking on the bright side. "She is terribly sunburned now." Pat's little brown face, with its fine satiny skin, flushed mutinously. She did not care if she were no beauty, but she disliked being criticized to her face like this. Judy would have said it wasn't manners. And then, when they went downstairs, Aunt Honor said in a tone of horror, "There's a rip in your dress, child." Pat wished they wouldn't call her child. She would have loved to stick her tongue out at Aunt Honor, but that wouldn't be manners either. She stood very stiff while Aunt Honor brought needle and thread and sewed it up. "Of course Mary can't attend to everything, and Judy Plum wouldn't care if they were all in rags," said Aunt Frances condoningly. "Judy would care,"
cried Pat. "She's very particular about our clothes and our manners. That shoulder ripped on the way over, so there!" In spite of this rather unproprietous beginning, the day was not so bad. Pat said her verses correctly, and Aunt Honor gave her a cookie and watched her eat it. Pat was in agonies of thirst, but was too shy to ask for a glass of water. When dinner came, however, there was plenty of milk. Judy would have said skim milk, but it was served in a lovely old gold-green glass pitcher that made the skimmiest of milk look like Jersey cream. The table was something of the leanest according to Silver Bush standards. Pat's portion of the viands was none too lavish, but she ate it off a plate with a colored border of autumn leaves. One of the famous Selby plates, 100 years old. Pat felt honored and tried not to feel hungry. For dessert she had 3 of the tabooed red plums. After dinner, Aunt Frances said she had a headache and was going to lay down. Cousin Dan suggested aspirin, but Aunt Frances crushed him with a look. "It is not God's will that we should take aspirin for relief from the pain He sends," she said loftily, and stalked off, with her red glass, silver-stoppered vinaigrette held to her nose. Aunt Honor turned Pat loose in the parlor, and told her to amuse herself. This Pat proceeded to do. Everything was of interest, and now she was alone she could have a good time. She'd been wondering how she could live through the afternoon if she had to sit it out with the aunts. Both she and Aunt Honor were mutually relieved to be rid of each other. Part 3. The parlor furniture was grand and splendid. There was a big, polished brass door handle in which she saw herself reflected with such a funny face. The china door plate had roses painted on it. The blinds were pulled down, and she loved the cool green light which filled the room. It made her feel like a mermaid in a shimmering sea pool. She loved the little procession of 6 white ivory elephants marching along the black mantle. She loved the big spotted shells on the whatnot, which murmured of the sea when she held them to her ear. And there was the famous vase, full of peacock feathers, that had made a face at Sarah Jenkins. It was of white glass, and had curious markings on its side that did resemble a face, but it did not grimace at Pat, though she wished it would. There was a brilliant red and yellow china hen sitting on a yellow nest in a corner table that was very wonderful. And there were deep Battenberg lace scallops on the window shades. Surely, even Castle McDermott couldn't beat that. Pat would have liked to see all the hidden things in the house. Not its furniture or its carpets, but the letters in old boxes upstairs, and the clothes in old trunks. But this was impossible. She dared not leave the parlor. The aunts would die of horror if they caught her prowling. When everything in the room had been examined, Pat curled herself up on the sofa and spent an absorbed hour looking at the pictures in old albums with faded blue and red plush bindings, and in hinged leather frames that opened and shut like a book. What funny old pictures in full skirts and big sleeves, and huge hats high up on the head. There was one of Aunt Frances in the 80s, in a flounced dress and a little sack with its sloping shoulders and square scallops, and a frilled parasol. Oh, you could just see how proud she was of that parasol. It seemed funny to think of Aunt Frances as a little girl with a frivolous parasol. There was a picture of Father, a young man without a mustache. Pat giggled over that. One of Mother, too, a round, plump face with bangs, and a big bow of ribbon in her hair, and one of Great Uncle Burton, who went away and was never heard of again. What fascination was in the phrase, even dead people were heard of again. They had funerals and headstones. And here was Aunt Honor as a baby, looking like Cuddles. Oh, would Cuddles ever look like Aunt Honor? It was unthinkable. How terribly people changed. Pat sighed.